Hi and welcome to today's live chapter reading of The Warrior by Nicole Flockton, courtesy of Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. The morning air was cool on Sienna's sweat-like skin. Her daily jog was the time she let everything release from her mind and focused on placing one foot in front of the other. Today, though, her mind was replaying the kiss she and Jude had shared over a week ago. Why she was still thinking about it, she had no idea. She hadn't seen him since the lodge function, when he'd pulled her away and looked at her as if she'd been an ogre. He'd mumbled something, which sounded like an apology, before storming off into the ballroom, leaving her standing shocked and aroused all at the same time. Stopping, she bent and rested her head on her knees, her breath sawing in and out. The sun was beginning to rise, chasing away the shadows. If only it would chase away her regrets. No, that wasn't right. She didn't regret kissing Jude. She'd been wanting to feel his lips against hers for so long. Reality was so much better than her imagination. Her only worry was now that she'd had a taste, no man would measure up. Which was totally ridiculous. Their lips had touched for all 30 seconds. 30 blissful seconds where she could imagine she had the right to touch and kiss him on a regular basis. Opening her eyes, Sienna pushed the thoughts away. Their kiss was a brief moment out of time. One that would never happen again, and she would have to live with that. She would be fine. She'd managed not to act on her attraction to Jude for the last 2 years, and she would continue to do so. After all, he was already acting as if their kiss hadn't happened. After stretching her legs again, she recommenced her jog back home. Today was a busy day at the shelter. She had to keep her focus on her job and not on one of the benefactors who made her job possible. That was another reason why she shouldn't have given in to the impulse to go to Jude when he'd looked so upset. Her job. She loved working with the homeless and at-risk kids, helping them to find their footing in the world and even repair their shattered relationships with their families when possible. Everything about her job was fulfilling, and she didn't want to lose that. As she climbed the stairs to her front door, she mentally folded up the memory of the kiss and being in Jude's arms, placing it in a box that was shoved to the far recesses of her mind and never to be pulled out again. 2 hours later, Sienna was questioning her love for her job. Rodney, this is the third time you've willfully destroyed a piece of furniture. Can you tell me why? The troubled youth crossed his arms and turned his head away from Sienna. This was the one part of the job she didn't like, having to turn a resident out of the shelter. But they had rules, and the rules were what kept her staff, plus the other kids, safe. As much as she wanted to keep giving Rodney chances, the time had come to acknowledge that perhaps he was going to fall into the category of one who couldn't be helped. She still wanted an explanation, though. Turning your face away from me won't cut it. Why did you do something you know was so wrong? His shoulders slumped a little, and he lost some of that tough boy look he'd been parading in front of everyone. Was he doing these things for attention? Should she give him another chance? She had to remember that there were more vulnerable kids in the home, kids who were doing the right thing, kids who'd suffered unspeakable acts against them, not to mention terrible tragedies. Rodney's lips firmly remained shut. This time it was her shoulders that slumped. Your refusal to answer is only going to make things worse. I don't want to do this, but I'm going to have to. Please go pack your belongings, Rodney. I'll have one of the staff escort you out. Before he could see the tears in her eyes, and as much as she tried to be hard-nosed and unemotional, sometimes she couldn't hide the disappointment of failure. And that's what she felt when she had to turn a kid out onto the street again. This place was supposed to be their refuge, the one place they could feel safe, yet sometimes they were too far lost and nothing anyone in the home did could pull them back. What? You can't do this. I'm sorry. Please give me another chance. I won't do it again. Rodney's pleas echoed around the hall. The desperation in his voice, the underlying fear tugged at her heart. The boy had been given 3 chances. If she gave him another one, she'd be setting a precedent for the other kids to see. She had to be strong, but it hurt her all the same. She paused and faced him. He looked so little and lonely, standing in the middle of the common area. How can I trust you won't do the same thing again if I give you another chance? That hadn't been what she meant to say, but now the words were out, she couldn't retract them, although it didn't mean she had to give in. I'm really sorry, Miss Townsend. I'll try to do better. I'm just not used to this. Not used to not being on the streets. There I had to fight for a piece of cardboard to sleep on, or a scrap of food to eat. I don't know how to deal with this. Sienna walked towards him again. The difference is, you're not fighting for anything here. You're just willfully destroying things, and that's not acceptable. She looked around at the staff mingling in the corners of the room, all ready to spring into action if needed. Someone had obviously alerted security to her plan to evict Rodney as two guards stood sentry at the door. Plus, you don't have to fight here. We give you what you need. It may not be a lot, but it's more than you had when you walked in. Fighting for things, as you said what you were doing, is not necessary here. What would the staff think if she gave him another chance? Would they believe she was weak, or would they appreciate she hadn't turned someone who needed their help away? I don't want to go out there again. Rodney's voice was low, wavering as if he was fighting away the tears. I feel safe here. Of all the things he could say to her that would sway her decision, those words right there were the ones. The mission of the Parklight Foundation and the purpose of the shelter was to provide safety to the most vulnerable. And for all his bravado and toughness, Rodney was one of those people. From what he'd just told her, she needed to talk to his counsellor and inform them of these thoughts. She doubted the boy had mentioned them during his sessions. Some kids just didn't want to talk about what they'd seen or experienced, even though it would help them if they did. Rodney was one of them, and he needed her help. She couldn't believe she was about to do something she'd never done before. Fine. One last chance, Rodney, but if you do anything to another resident, staff, or piece of furniture, then you're out of here. No excuses. She narrowed her gaze at him. He straightened, but his fingers trembled by his side. Don't make me regret this decision. Rodney shook his head vigorously. I promise I won't do anything any more. Sienna hoped his assertion was true, because otherwise she just made a mistake in judgment, and that didn't sit well with her. Jude Cadmon walked through the door of the Parklight shelter and almost turned around. For the last few days he'd been avoiding coming to this place because of the woman who ran it, and because of what he'd done with her. A slow burn coursed through his veins as the kiss he'd been trying so hard to forget slammed into his mind, a regular occurrence ever since he'd let his emotions get the better of him. He'd known the moment his lips touched Sienna's he'd made a mistake. He'd always suspected that the second he tasted her, things would change for him. And they had. He wanted more, but he couldn't have it. Until he found Renee, his sister, his own happiness had to take a back seat. Was that a bit martyrish of him? No doubt, but how could he go on with his life when it was through his own fault that his sister had been taken? He should have been more insistent about making sure she'd got home safely. He could have left his lodge meeting earlier to pick her up from the library and drive her to where she'd parked her car. She'd be so confident that she'd be fine during the last phone call they'd shared. She'd laughed off the concerns he'd expressed when he'd found out that she'd parked at the far end of the train station parking lot. Told him to stop being a worrywart, and she was more than capable to walk in the dark to her car. It burned that he'd been right. He pressed a closed fist against his chest, the guilt beating in time with his heart. He should have done more. Jude blew out a frustrated breath. No matter how many times he'd wished things could be different, they weren't, and he just had to accept it. Now they had a lead on Renee's possible whereabouts. Although it had been a couple of weeks since they'd received the information from Tim, so who knew if it was still a viable one? Some yelling had him pushing thoughts of Renee away and propelling him down the hall towards the sound. Give it to me, it's mine. Jude slid to a halt when he spied that the staff from the home were also on the scene. It wasn't his place to interfere unless he had to. Glancing around, he couldn't see Sienna, but imagined she wouldn't be too far away. What would she do when she saw him? More to the point, what would he do? The two teenage girls were grappling over a book. He supposed the book was better than something harmful, but he would hate to see the thing being ripped apart. What's going on? The hairs on the back of his head stood to attention as Sienna's voice resounded around the room. She came striding into the open area from a corridor opposite to where he stood. Her focus was on the girls, and he took a moment to admire her. The black trousers she wore were slim-fitting and finished just on her ankle. The pale purple shirt she wore was tucked in, but didn't hide her generous curves. Her glorious red hair was pulled back in a low ponytail. "I was reading this book and then Rona snatched it out of my hand," a girl with dark hair complained to Sienna. Rona tugged the book back again. "That's because I was reading it yesterday, and Tammy knew that." Jade surveyed the room again. A few of the other kids had started to come into the area as well as some of the adults who helped at the shelter. As former military, and still with a hand in the security business, his senses went on high alert to ensure that none of the bystanders got involved and created more issues. Even with the security at the home, there was always that element of the unknown, and he'd been caught out a few times when well deployed not to be extra vigilant. Not that he thought someone was going to open fire or let off a bomb. "Girls, you two are going to have to sort out this petty one-man-shit that you've got going on. Tammy, there are plenty of books in the library you could have chosen from. You didn't need to take a book you knew Rona was reading." Sienna's voice was evenly modulated so as not to increase the ire of the other girl. "Rona, you know that snatching something from someone isn't nice. Next time ask for assistance. There are plenty of staff who can help both of you." Rona released her hold on the book, and when she did, the tension on Jude's shoulders subsided as well. He was seeing firsthand again why Sienna had been employed to run the house. She was strict but fair. Her time in the military had served her well. He guessed she probably had to put up with a lot of crap from some of the guys in her platoon. They'd both been in the army, but she'd been stationed in Cairns, while he'd been stationed in Perth with the SAS. The crowd dispersed and the girls retreated to their rooms, he assumed. The whisper of fabric was the only warning that someone was approaching him. "Jude, this is a surprise. Is there something I can help you with?" If that wasn't a loaded question, he didn't know what was. There was plenty she could help him with. It just wasn't a good idea that she did. All the reasons for him coming to see her drifted out of his mind with her being so close to him. He mentally shook his head. He really needed to get a handle on his attraction. It was more inconvenient than unwanted. He'd been attracted to Sienna from the moment he'd first laid eyes on her. "I wanted to see how the new kids were settling in. Also, a couple of the employees at one of the restaurants have found other jobs, so we've got a couple of positions to fill. Do you think you've got some kids who would be suitable?" Finally, he remembered why he'd come in. Helping the kids at the homeless shelter get a chance to earn money, not to mention give them the help they needed to be reunited with their families, or to get their own places to live. It was one of the main reasons he and his friends had purchased some fast food restaurants. That decision had turned out to be one of the best they could make. So many kids, as well as adults, had found their financial feet and were now succeeding in other jobs. "Definitely. Let's go to my office and we can discuss possible candidates. Do you want something to eat or drink?" "No thanks, I'm good." Sienna nodded and turned to head down to her office. Jude stood for a few seconds, watching the gentle sway of her hips, admiring the way the fabric of her pants cupped her ass, before his common sense returned. He strode quickly to catch up with her, his fingers brushing against hers. Electricity buzzed through him, and he shoved his hands in his pants pocket to stop him from reaching out and linking their fingers together. As he followed Sienna into her office, her light floral scent, a subtle rose flower, hit his senses, and he breathed deeply. A rose was delicate but strong, and that's how he thought of Sienna, although he wouldn't say that to her, not if he wanted to live. Her office was neat and tidy, exactly how he expected to be. He was the same. A hang-up from their army days, no doubt always concerned about the chances of a random spot check to see if their rooms were regulation. "Do you normally have situations like the one I walked in on?" Her eyes narrowed and he inwardly winced. His question was a bit intrusive, but as one of the major benefactors to the shelter, he wanted to ensure that there was no one in danger while they worked there. Least of all, Sienna. "Yes, although not every day. Now, shall we discuss why you came here?" His eyebrows rose and his body responded to the action. Since when did a raised eyebrow turn him on so? Since it was done by one Sienna Townsend, it seemed. Jude sat and crossed his ankles, giving the impression he was relaxed and calm. But years in the military had him always on alert, no matter how he looked. Do we need to look at getting more security? He didn't know why he couldn't let what happened earlier go. The girls hadn't given the impression they were about to take each other on and get violent, but some of the kids had to do unpleasant things to keep themselves alive on the streets or in the countries they'd been taken to. Coming back to an environment where they weren't threatened and every second of their day they weren't looking over their shoulders to keep out of trouble took some adjusting. Sienna regarded him with what Jude could only call a stink eye and sat as well. No, we don't need more security. The girls will settle down. They're finding their way. You know they were in the last group of girls that were rescued from overseas. You know what they had to go through, how they had to battle for even the smallest morsel of food. It's going to take a while to adjust to not having to fight for everything all the time. The sadness in her eyes as she spoke about the kids pierced him in the chest. Had anyone ever asked Sienna how she was doing, how she was coping with all that she saw and dealt with every day? He knew he hadn't, and he was pretty sure his friends hadn't either. Was it because he knew she was military and therefore could handle things? How arrogant of him to think that way. If anyone should know what a soldier went through during their service and after they were discharged, it was him. The nights he'd woken up in a cold sweat, not only from fear of Renee, but also reliving the trauma of what he'd seen and done overseas, were too many to count. Do you need some assistance? He asked after the silence dragged between him. No, I'm fine. It's just. Her eyes skittered away from him, something she'd never done in the past. She'd always met his gaze. He waited for her to continue. It looked like she wasn't going to elaborate. What was going on with her? Yes, she said she was fine and didn't need any help, but she was holding back something. What was she keeping him from? She had she gotten news about Renee and didn't want to tell him about it? He knew a lot of the information that they had received were through her contacts with various organisations they worked with around the world. As the shelter's manager, they tended to contact her, not him, or his other Freemason brothers. Plus, if there was anything new, he was sure Tim would have told him about it. It's just what? Shit, this wasn't working out what to say. She was resigning because he'd kissed her, was she? He would never forgive himself if that's what she was considering. He'd crossed the line, and it didn't matter if his emotions were teetering out of control. That, in a moment of weakness, he'd succumbed to the desire that always flowed through him whenever she was around. He should have known better, should have done better.